She called me from a gas station payphone at 2 in the morning, and I almost didn't recognize her voice. My sister Diana has always been the strong one, the one who held our family together after our mother passed, the one who worked double shifts and still had dinner on the table, the one who never once asked anyone for anything. So when she finally called, I knew it was bad. You don't break a 62-year-old woman like that overnight. You do it slowly, the way water erodes stone, one small humiliation at a time, until she doesn't even remember what she looked like before she was afraid. I had been living alone in Savannah for 3 years by then, retired from the Marines after 30 years of service. Just me and my dog and my quiet mornings on the back porch. People ask me sometimes if I miss it, the structure, the purpose, the mission. I tell them the truth. I never stopped having a mission. I just hadn't found the right one yet. She didn't say much on that phone call. She didn't have to. I heard Sophie crying in the background, and that was enough. Sophie is my great niece. My niece Claire's little girl, 4 years old, small for her age, with these enormous brown eyes that look like they're always asking a question the world hasn't answered yet. I'd only met her twice in person, once when she was born and once at Christmas 2 years ago. When she fell asleep in my lap holding a candy cane she'd refused to eat because she said it was too pretty to bite. That was the kind of child she was. The kind of child who deserved better than whatever was happening at 2 in the morning that had her grandmother calling me from a gas station payphone. I was in my truck by 3. In Atlanta by 8. Diana opened the door and I had to work very hard to keep my face neutral. She had a bruise along her jaw that she'd tried to cover with makeup and hadn't quite managed. Her right wrist was wrapped in an ace bandage. She looked like she'd lost 15 pounds since Christmas, and not the healthy kind of weight loss. The kind that comes from forgetting to eat because you're too busy surviving. Before I could say a word, she grabbed my arm and pulled me inside and whispered, "They can't know you're here to help. They'll make things worse." I looked past her into the living room, and I understood immediately what she meant by they. Raymond Cobb sat on the couch with his boots up on the coffee table, watching television like he owned the place, because in his mind, he did. He was Claire's husband, a big man gone soft around the middle, with a chin that had multiplied itself and small eyes set too close together. He barely glanced at me when I walked in, just reached over and turned up the volume on the TV. From the kitchen came the sound of his mother, Loretta, running water and complaining loudly about the dish soap. Loretta Cobb was 70 pounds of pure contempt wrapped in a floral blouse. She'd moved in 4 months ago, she and her daughter Sheila both, after Loretta claimed her apartment flooded. The apartment had not flooded. I would later learn this, but by the time I arrived, they had been living in Diana's house for 4 months without paying a single dollar toward rent, utilities, or groceries, and they showed no signs of leaving. Diana owned that house outright. She'd paid it off herself after 30 years of nursing. It was the only real thing she had, that house, and 3 people had moved into it and made it feel like a prison. I found Sophie in the hallway, pressed against the wall between a laundry basket and the bathroom door, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better years. She was wearing a nightgown that had a small tear at the hem. She looked up at me with those enormous eyes and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Are you Grandma's brother?" I crouched down to her level. "I am," I said. "My name's Arthur. What's yours?" She looked at me very carefully, the way children do when they're deciding whether to trust you. "Sophie," she said. And then quieter, "They took my rabbit's eye last week." She held up the rabbit so I could see the spot where one button eye was missing. "Tyler did it. He said it was ugly anyway." Tyler was Sheila's son, 6 years old, already raised to believe the world owed him whatever he pointed at. I told Sophie that her rabbit was beautiful, that one eye just meant the rabbit had been on more adventures than most. She looked at me for another moment, and then she leaned forward and put her small forehead against my shoulder, and I had to breathe very carefully to keep myself steady. Before I even had my bag unpacked, I understood that what Diana needed was not for me to storm in swinging. She needed something smarter than that. Raymond Cobb was not a man who responded to confrontation the way a reasonable person does. Men like Raymond take confrontation as an invitation to escalate. He had already put Diana in the hospital once, 6 months ago. A story she told me in fragments over the first 2 days, always stopping when she heard footsteps, always glancing at the doorway. She had told the hospital she fell. She had believed, or made herself believe, that if she just stayed calm and kept the peace, things would eventually get better. They had not gotten better. They had gotten systematically worse. And here was the thing about Raymond and Loretta and Sheila that I noticed within the first 24 hours. They were not careful around me because they had decided very quickly that I was not a threat. I was an old man. I walked slowly because of my hip, which I had injured in '91 and which still gives me trouble in the cold. I asked Diana to repeat things sometimes. I forgot where I'd put my coffee mug twice in one morning. Raymond watched me do it, and I saw the exact moment he made his assessment. He relaxed his shoulders. He stopped watching me the way he watched Diana, with that coiled readiness, and started watching me the way people watch furniture. I decided to help him reach that conclusion. I started leaving my coffee mug in the wrong place on purpose. I called Loretta by the wrong name 3 times in 2 days, always apologizing with great embarrassment. I asked Raymond where the bathroom was, even though I had used it a dozen times. I shuffled a little more when I walked. I let my sentences trail off in the middle as though I'd lost the thread. By day 3, Loretta had started speaking to me in the loud, slow voice people use with children and the very old. By day 4, Raymond had stopped lowering his voice when I was in the room. That was exactly what I needed. I had my phone in my shirt pocket every hour of every day, recording. I had brought a small secondary device, a digital recorder I'd used for years to record my own notes, and I left it in the kitchen under the edge of a dish towel because the kitchen was where the real conversations happen. Diana thought I was just visiting. She didn't know about the recorder. I didn't tell her because Diana has never been able to hide what she knows, and I needed the Cobbs to keep believing they were among allies. On the 5th day, I heard everything I needed to hear. I was in the hallway, supposedly resting, and the kitchen door was not fully closed. Loretta and Raymond were talking about Diana's house. Loretta said that the house was worth at least $400,000 and that it was a waste sitting in Diana's name when Diana could be moved somewhere more appropriate for her situation. Raymond said that the old man, meaning me, was clearly losing it and that having 2 people in diminished states in one house was actually an argument for conservatorship. Sheila asked what conservatorship meant, and Raymond explained that it meant getting a court to decide that Diana couldn't manage her own affairs, which would transfer control to a family member, namely Raymond, as the husband of Diana's daughter. Loretta said they needed to move while I was still visiting, because an independent witness, even a confused one, would make the whole thing look more legitimate. I lay very still in the hallway and listened to all of it, and did not move a single muscle. That evening, a man came to the house. He introduced himself as a legal consultant, a friend of Raymond's cousin, and he sat at the kitchen table with a folder of documents and explained to Diana that this was simply a protective measure, a way of ensuring that her affairs were properly managed as she got older. Nothing to worry about. Just a formality, really. Diana sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the table and said almost nothing. Claire sat beside her mother and held her hand and looked like she was trying to disappear. I shuffled into the kitchen in my slippers and asked if anyone wanted tea. The legal consultant looked at me with exactly the sympathetic patience that Raymond had coached him toward. He said, "No, thank you, sir. We're just finishing up some paperwork here." I said, "Oh, paperwork. I used to love paperwork, back when I could remember where I put my pen." I laughed at myself. Loretta laughed too, the kind of laugh that means he's harmless. Raymond said, "Arthur, why don't you go watch some TV? Let the adults handle this." I said, of course, sorry to interrupt, and I shuffled back out. But not before I set my phone on the counter, next to the fruit bowl with the camera facing the table and the voice memo already running. I want to be honest about what happened next because I've told this story a few times now, and people always want it to be more dramatic than it was. They want a scene where I throw the door open and announce myself and everyone gasps. The truth is that justice, real justice, rarely looks like a movie. It looks like patience. It looks like 67 years of learning when to be loud and when to be quiet, when to be seen and when to disappear. What I did was go to the living room and sit with Sophie, who was trying to put a puzzle together on the floor, and I helped her for 20 minutes. And then I called my attorney in Savannah on my personal cell with the volume all the way down, and I told him what was happening, and he told me exactly what to say to whom and in what order. By the time the legal consultant left with his unsigned papers, I had already sent 3 separate files to 3 separate email addresses. The kitchen recording, the hallway recording from the day before, and a summary of everything Diana had told me about the past 18 months typed out in the truck the night before, time-stamped, witnessed electronically by my attorney. Loretta made dinner that night as if nothing had happened. She made a big pot of something and told Diana she should eat more and complimented herself loudly on her cooking. Raymond drank 2 beers and watched football, and at one point told me directly that Diana was lucky to have family who looked out for her since she'd never been good with practical matters. He said it with the easy confidence of a man who has never once been wrong about anything because no one in his life has ever held him accountable for being wrong. I said, I think you're absolutely right about that. Diana does have people looking out for her. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his game. I slept on the pull-out couch in the back room. I barely slept at all. I lay there going through everything in my head the way I used to do the night before an operation, running the steps in order, anticipating the variables, identifying where things could go sideways and how I'd adjust. I've been doing this since I was 22 years old, and the specifics have changed, but the feeling never has. That particular kind of alert stillness, the sense of a door about to open. Around midnight, I heard Raymond on the phone in the master bedroom. The walls in that house are not thick. He was talking to someone, his cousin, or the legal consultant, and he was saying that the old man was even more out of it than he expected, that it was almost too easy, that Diana was going to be taken care of before the end of the month. He said that word, taken care of, and I heard the way he meant it, which was not the way it sounds when someone says it about a person they love. In the morning, I asked Diana to take a walk with me. We walked to the end of the block and sat on a bench under a pin oak, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is not her nature. By the time I finished, she was looking at her hands in her lap, and she was very quiet for a moment, and then she said, I knew what he was planning. I just didn't know how to stop it. I told her she didn't have to know how. That was my job. She looked at me then, and I saw something come back into her face that I hadn't seen since I arrived. Not quite herself yet, but the outline of herself. The person who had raised her daughter alone and paid off that house and worked double shifts and never once asked for anything. I squeezed her hand and said, Do you trust me? She said, Arthur, you're the only person I've trusted completely my entire life. We went back to the house and I made a phone call from the backyard. Then I made another. Then I sat at the kitchen table and I waited. The knock on the door came at 11 o'clock. 2 officers and a detective. Diana had officially filed a report that morning, for the first time, while I sat beside her and my attorney was on the phone. She had filed for the assault 6 months ago that put her in the hospital. She had filed for financial coercion. She had filed for the conservatorship scheme, which my attorney had already flagged to the State Bar Association regarding the legal consultant. Raymond answered the door before anyone else could get there. He had the immediate look of a man who was calculating his options and not finding good ones. The detective asked if they could come in. Raymond said there must be some mistake. The detective said she didn't think so. What happened after that was not satisfying in the way people expect when they hear a story like this. Raymond did not crumble immediately. He argued. He performed. He told the officers that Diana was confused, that I was confused, that this was a family misunderstanding being blown out of proportion by an elderly man with obvious cognitive decline. He said that last part with great confidence, looking directly at me. I placed my phone on the kitchen table and pressed play. Raymond's own voice filled the room. Then Loretta's. Then the conversation with the legal consultant, all of it clear as water. The word conservatorship, the word formality, the phrase the old man is even more out of it than I expected. The detective watched Raymond's face as he listened to himself. She said, "Is that your voice, sir?" Raymond said nothing. Loretta started talking immediately, overlapping herself, saying it was taken out of context, saying she was just trying to help her son-in-law manage a difficult family situation, saying that Diana had always been prone to exaggeration. She kept talking, even as the detective held up a hand to stop her. She was the kind of woman who believed that if she just kept producing words, reality would eventually bend to accommodate them. It did not accommodate them that day. Raymond was taken in for questioning. The legal consultant, whose bar license turned out to be from a state he hadn't lived in for 4 years, was flagged for investigation. Loretta and Sheila were not arrested that morning, but they were asked to vacate the property within 48 hours, as my attorney had already established that Diana was the sole owner and had never invited them as permanent residents. Loretta cried. Not the kind of crying that comes from genuine remorse, The kind that comes from finally encountering something that doesn't move when you push against it. I watched her from across the kitchen, and I felt nothing except a very clear, quiet steadiness. Tyler, for his part, stood in the middle of the living room with his small suitcase and looked genuinely confused. For all his entitled swagger, he was 6 years old. He was a product, not a cause. I crouched down and I said, "Hey, bud, do you know what happened to Sophie's rabbit?" He looked at the floor. I said gently. "You took it." He reached into his jacket pocket without a word and put the small brown button on the coffee table. I said, "That was the right thing to do. Now you and Sophie are even. You got a clean start." He looked up at me then, and I could see that nobody had ever spoken to him quite that way, like his choices mattered, like he was capable of something better than what he'd been taught. I don't know what becomes of children like Tyler. I hope for them more than I expect for them. That's the most honest thing I can say. Diana fixed Sophie's rabbit that afternoon with a needle and thread from the sewing kit in the hall closet. Sophie sat at the kitchen table and watched with complete concentration as her grandmother sewed the button back on. And when Diana held it up and said, "Good as new," Sophie took the rabbit and held it against her chest and said, "He looks happy." Claire sat across from her mother, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she just watched. She didn't check the door. She didn't flinch at sounds from the hallway. She sat in her mother's kitchen with her shoulders down and her face open, and she let herself exist in a room without calculating the cost. I made coffee and didn't say anything, because some moments don't need words. Raymond and Claire's divorce took 4 months. The house stayed in Diana's name. My attorney ensured that Raymond's scheme, documented as it was included in the proceedings, which did not help his case in front of the judge. Some people believe that what I did was extreme, involving police and attorneys and recordings and official filings, when it could have been handled quietly, privately, between family. Those people have never been in a house where a woman flinches when a door opens. You don't handle things like that quietly. Quiet is what let it go on for 18 months. Quiet is what put Diana in the hospital and taught Sophie to press herself into corners and hold her rabbit like it was the last safe thing in the world. Quiet is a kindness to the wrong people. I stayed in Atlanta for 6 weeks, longer than I planned. I repainted the living room with Diana, a soft green that she'd wanted for years but Raymond said was too much. I fixed the back step that had been loose since before I arrived. I taught Sophie to play gin rummy with the children's rules I made up as we went, and she beat me twice and was deeply suspicious both times, convinced I'd let her win. I hadn't. She was genuinely good at it. The night before I drove back to Savannah, Diana and I sat on the back porch the way we used to sit on the steps outside our mother's house when we were young, and the neighborhood was loud and we had not yet learned how much the world could cost you. She said, "I keep thinking about all the time I wasted being afraid of him." I said, "That time wasn't wasted. That time was you surviving until somebody came through the door." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I should have called you sooner." I told her what I believe to be true, which is that people call when they're ready and not a moment before, and that what matters is that she called. She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was 9 years old, and we shared a bedroom, and the world felt too large and too loud to face alone. I want to tell you something before I finish, because I've thought about it a great deal since I drove back to Savannah and sat on my own back porch with my own coffee in the early morning quiet. I spent 30 years as a Marine. I have been in situations that I don't discuss at dinner tables and that I do not use to make myself sound impressive. I know what I'm capable of when circumstances demand it. That knowledge is not a comfortable thing to carry. It is something you learn to manage, the way you manage a blade, carefully, with respect for what it can do. Always aware that the purpose of a weapon is not to be used, but to make certain things unnecessary. What Raymond Cobb and his family needed from me was not force. They needed to be seen. They needed someone to stand in the room who was not afraid of them and who was not going to be managed or dismissed or overwhelmed by the sheer relentlessness of their entitlement. That is sometimes the entire job. Just being present. Just being someone who is not going to move. I have seen strong people stay silent for years because they told themselves it wasn't bad enough yet, it wasn't the right moment, they didn't want to make things worse. I've done it myself in other circumstances, in other rooms. And I want to say as directly as I know how, there is no moment that gets better by waiting. There is no situation that improves because you kept quiet long enough. The people who are counting on your silence know something you've forgotten, which is that silence looks exactly like permission from the outside. Diana called me for 2 in the morning because she'd finally run out of silence. I was grateful every single day that I was still someone she could call. If you have a Diana in your life, if you have a Sophie pressing herself into a corner somewhere holding something broken, please don't wait for 2 in the morning. Please don't wait until the options are smaller and the cost is higher and the damage is already done. You don't have to be a Marine. You don't have to have 30 years of anything. You just have to be willing to walk through the door and stay there. I'm Arthur. Thank you for listening to this story. If it reached you somewhere true, share it with someone who needs it. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been the person someone called? Or were you the one who finally made the call? Every voice in this room matters. I read each one. I'll see you in the next story.